All right, I'm Dr. Tom Bowman. I'm the Director of the Research Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Dave Richards. Dr. Richards teaches courses in international relations and comparative politics, including international relations theory, U.S. foreign policy, and Latin America. He has taught at the University of Lynchburg for 19 years. His interests include U.S. policy in the Americas, nationalism in the Caribbean, and the politics of ethnic diversity in the Americas. He's currently working on several articles on the intersection of the Disney company and politics. Please welcome Dr. Dave Richards.
I'm going to try the microphone just because I tend to wander, but we'll see how this works. So, in case you're wondering what this is so 2 years ago, Disney Company had its 100th anniversary. The founding of the Disney Company in 1923, when they started making these shorts called Alice in Wonderland. This is actually Little Red Riding Hood from 1921, one of the first, or one of the remaining Disney cartoons that Disney probably actually drew on this cartoon, along with his partner Ub Iwerks and some other folks. But this is through the Kansas City Film Company, so it's pre-Disney technically. Okay. So let's see. There we go. Okay, so the talk I'm going to give today is the Disney, DeSantis and the Dissolution of the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which is a nice mouthful there. But basically, I'm going to be talking about a sort of political incident that the Disney Corporation encountered in 2023. In Florida, and when they tangled with the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. I originally presented this summer at the Popcorn Network's conference on Disney. That was actually the second conference this summer that I attended virtually on Disney studies, to give you an idea about sort of this emerging field of studies. Unfortunately, as a political scientist, I'm a little alone at these places because they're mostly communications or pop culture folks, sociology, gender studies, things like that, anthropology, and historians. But there are beginning to be sort of other folks interested as well. So, to give you a background, the case that happened was when the Disney Corporation criticized a Florida law about the teaching of LGBTQ plus information in K through 12 schools. And the response from the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, was to basically try to punish the Disney Corporation. And I'm going to give you some background, so that you can kind of get some context. But what I eventually looked at in the paper that I wrote was how both parties used framing and word choice to try to sort of persuade the public and maybe perhaps the public at large about how they were in the right position. And so I think it was just kind of interesting to see language and the way it was used in this political situation. But before that, I need to give you some context, or want to give you some context about sort of what is going on and why is this even an issue. So we go back to the beginning. Actually, this is not the beginning. This is the beginning of Disney World, the resort, 1971. This is Roy Disney. This is Walt Disney's brother, older brother, who ran the company after Walt Disney died. Before that, he was the CFO of the company from pretty much day one. Then if we go back, this is even further, but really what we want to go back to is the 1940s and 50s in the United States, and really in Europe, the developed world as well. So the myth is that Walt Disney was sitting on a park bench, noticed how dirty everything was while his two daughters rode, I think probably a carousel, and he wondered why he had to sit at the bench, like, well, there's nothing for him to do, and the park was dirty, it was not very inviting, and wouldn't it be better to have something else? And voila, he invents Disneyland. Okay, that's not actually 100% accurate, although that very event may have happened. When Disney is emerging as a popular culture figure in the late 1920s. Once Mickey Mouse starts in 1928, he instantly sort of takes off. Disney had success the year before with Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, but he didn't own that copyright, so it was taken from him. Now, if he was to go out with his kids, this is well after 1928, and he wanted to go to some sort of amusement park, he would have basically two choices. One is what I would call a carnival. These were usually kind of packed into small lots. Some of them might have been more or less permanent. This is Victor's Kiddieland in Los Angeles, which was a popular park in the 1950s. You can see relatively small, not much in the way of landscaping, if any. It's basically a parking lot that's been converted. Bigger parks might have been more temporary. They might have been county or state fairs. Sometimes, of course, Coney Island is the one that springs to mind as a very, permanent one that operated during usually summer seasons, right? So in California, Southern California, the summer season was essentially all year long. In other parts of the country, summer season would be limited, and these would not necessarily always be permanent. But due to the nature of how these things worked, most of the rides were owned by individuals, and so they were crowded in, as many as you could possibly put in a lot, etc. On the other end of the spectrum were what you could probably call gardens or some sort of horticultural space. These pleasure parks were usually family-oriented. They usually did feature some sort of horticultural exhibit, so like some sort of nice garden, culture gardens of some sort. They had limited what we would call rides. Maybe they would have a carousel, maybe they'd have swan boats or something in the water, but not a carnival atmosphere. But very nice, beautifully landscaped. Families would go there for picnics, maybe to hear a concert at the band shell. One of the most famous ones was in Denmark, Tivoli Park, and this is Disney when he went to Europe would have toured Tivoli and seen it. This was a little bit more advanced, I guess. They did have more rides, as it were, but still essentially a park. Hershey's Park, or Hershey Park in Hershey, Pennsylvania, another example, built for the edification and leisure of Hershey employees. Today, of course, it is a more traditional amusement park, but back then it was started more as what we would call these leisure parks. The other one I want to highlight is Fairy Tale Land in Oakland, because if you have ever been to Disneyland, this looks really familiar, right? Disney was not afraid to be inspired. This was well before Disneyland, but it was relatively small, definitely aimed at very small children, but still exists today if you go there. Okay, so where does this idea for a park really come from? Disney's going to Tivoli or some other place. Well, it stems from a couple of different things. One is when he built a studio, so after the success of Snow White, he builds a purpose-built studio for animation. And that studio still exists today. You can still visit it. It's still Disney Studios. But he had a problem in that people would come to the studio expecting something other than what essentially looks like a really nice Art Deco office park. In the back of their mind, they knew this wasn't the case, but they kind of expected Mickey and Minnie to be living in one of the houses or something like that, right? And they were kind of disappointed. And Walt, being a showman, was kind of disappointed that he couldn't show the Mickey and Minnie living in the little house. And so they had a small lot across the street in Burbank, and his idea was to build a small park. We're talking about less than 10 acres, so that when people came to the studio, there would be something for them to do once they realized it was essentially an office building with desks. So he drew up, or had this drawn up. You can see some interesting foreshadowing here, right? So here's your carnival area, your carnival rides. You have a railway that goes around here. You have a river or some sort of body of water. You have an Indian village and a Western village, and then maybe an old-time village here. Luckily, in a way, he went to the city of Burbank with this plan, and they said, we are not having a carnival in Burbank because that is beneath us. And they said, no. But Disney kept percolating this idea. He went to a centennial celebration of the railway in Chicago, which was a 2-year kind of World's Fair type thing about trains. Disney and some of his employees were dotty about trains. One of his employees, Walt Kimball, had a scale model train in his yard. Disney liked it so much that when he built his new house, he put a scale model around the perimeter of his property. And when he went to Chicago, he realized that people were there to just look at these things. It was a kind of a carnival atmosphere. And he said, well, if they built a park with a railway around it, people would come to look at the railway and then maybe stop and ride the carousels and things like that. So he decided that what he wanted to do was build a bigger park than this somewhere near the studio that he could then build a big train and run and operate this train, as well as, do some other stuff. But as he began to think about this and plan it, in sort of typical Disney fashion, it exploded into something much bigger, and he realized he needed money. So he was going to go to the Bank of America and ask for money. On a Monday morning, he was going to fly out, and so Friday evening, he called up one of his animators, and he said, I need you to come into the studio, and we're going to draw a drawing of what this Disney park would be, Disneyland. And the guy said, well, as long as you feed me milkshakes and hamburgers, I'll do it. So for like 48 hours, literally, this guy kept drawing these things, and he ends up with this picture that Walt rolls up and takes with him to the Bank of America. And this is the first kind of imagining of Disneyland. You could already see things like the pirate ship and the castle, and of course, the railroad. So Disney he gets a company to help him look the land, and they find an orange grove, 150 acres of orange grove at the end of a freeway in Orange County, California. And this is God's country. This is hell and gone from anything. But Disney could see well enough into the future that this freeway was going to bring housing and business to this part of California, and it would be a perfect place to put his park. Now, contrary to sort of stories was, when he bought this land, which is roughly this rectangle here, right? So here's the park, here is parking, and actually they owned some land over here where the hotel would go. Disney knew that he had to get as much land as possible because he wanted it to be an experience, and he didn't want people to kind of break the spell. His solution to that is actually building an earth berm around here so that if you are standing in Disneyland, eye level, you cannot see anything outside of it. But he also knew that he was going to run out of money if he kept buying land, because once word got out that he was buying the land, all of a sudden the prices went way up because people knew what was going on. So he had to stop buying land and start actually building the park. As it was, he didn't have enough money. That's a whole other story. But the result was that within a year or two of opening, because so many people came here, right? The first year, they thought they would hit 500,000 people if they were successful. They hit 1 million people. Right away, hotels, gas stations, cheap souvenir stands, people began buying up the land around Disneyland in order to cash in on this incredible thing going on. And Disney always felt really badly because when people, if you've ever been to Disneyland, you drive off the highway through essentially downtown Orange County. And, so the magic is gone, all that. Today, right, Disney, this is today's Disney land, which includes California Adventure and some other things. They bought the hotel back from the company that they had sold the rights to. It sits on about 150 acres, so they have been able to make it about 4 times as big as when they started in 1955. But still, if you look at Disneyland today, it's in the middle of the city, essentially. And Disney really felt that this was problematic. So his first problem was, his problem was that this was California. And 1955, the East Coast was very far away. And he knew that as many people as he was getting to come here, that he was missing, half the country, 2/3 of the country, and that he should build a park on the East Coast. He wanted to avoid two things. One is this, right? He wanted to get enough land that he could keep the businesses, the hotels at bay, or at least the hotels would be licensed and therefore he could control the quality. The second thing was, this was located in the middle of Orange County, and every time he wanted to paint a park bench, he had to go to the Orange County government and get permission. And he felt that this was burdensome. Now, to be honest, Orange County has been very cooperative, but they just announced a huge overhaul. Disneyland in 10 years will look completely different. And there were lots of groups within the city that felt that, they wanted to oppose a lot of this. Because they felt it would be noisy or it would disrupt traffic and things like that. So Disney's solution was to go to Central Florida and around Orlando, which was a pretty sleepy village. You can ask Julius Sigler about that. He grew up there before Disney. And he purchased 25,000 acres, right? So not 100, but 25,000 acres, or about 40 square miles of essentially swampland. But he then could keep those hotels, keep those souvenir stands at bay. The second thing is that he sat down with the governor, the then governor of Florida, who then went to the legislature, and they passed a bill organizing the Reedy Creek Improvement District. And this was essentially, so what this allowed Disney to do, this is Epcot. Here's your World Showcase, and the giant golf ball thing here. And you can see there's stuff around it. Most of that is Disney hotels, by the way. But there's stuff around it, but it's not in the middle of the city. So he could control what was there. The Reedy Creek District, though, was the real key. And what this was a business improvement district that would be independent of the two counties that Disney World is in, Osage and Orange, again, it would allow Disney greater control as to what was going on, because here's how the improvement district worked. It was responsible for improving the district, making it business friendly. In order to do that, the only people that could serve on it would be people from local businesses. Guess how many local businesses there were in this district? One. So Disney got its people on the Reedy Creek board, and of course when Disney showed up and said, we want to do X, Y, and Z, the board would be like, yes, 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 and if you have anything else you forgot about, we approve that too. So very good control. And what did this allow them to do, right? So it allowed them to have direct control over what's going on, but even better, that district could issue bonds. So Disney put in water, sewage, highways, electrification at the expense of the taxpayers in the district. Now the taxpayers were Disney, but of course where did Disney get that tax money? From its visitors. So this was a very good way for Disney to pass costs on, and this comes up later as well. This allowed Disney to do all sorts of things. In fact, one of the provisions in the original agreement was that Disney could build a nuclear reactor to generate electricity. Now, they didn't ever do that. But this really solved that big problem for Disney, where they didn't have to check in. Now, they still had to follow Florida state law and federal law, right? They were not, completely free of control. But it's a remarkable thing from a political science perspective that you have a corporation essentially controlling a local government for all intents and purposes, right? And really being free of local control. That was a pretty remarkable thing. So the government, like I said, was made up of Disney employees. There are two cities in this area, which are actually very small towns, but they don't actually get a say in what the Reedy Creek District does, because they are not part of the business community. Now, in Disney's defense, I guess you would say, The green area, for example, a lot of it is wildlife conservation, so they have tried their best to be sort of good stewards in a way. But it's pretty remarkable what they have here, right? So you have these two cities, Bay Lake and Buena Vista. You have lots of waterway, you have a lot of roads, 175 miles of roads, which, again, all paid for by raising bonds and selling bonds, not by Disney themselves. Okay, so in 2022, Ron DeSantis is a rising political figure in the Republican Party. If we can cast our minds back to 2021, when Trump had been convicted of some felonies, he was considered sort of dead man walking and washed up. He had lost the election to Joe Biden, and that was that. In American politics, once you lose, of course, you were gone for good. So the Republican Party was looking for somebody to replace Trump, and Ron DeSantis was this rising star who was to the right of Trump, and wanted to sort of prove that he was the guy to push the MAGA platform forward. And part of that he did was in the state of Florida. This was also, to connect it back to Virginia, this is 2021, parental rights and what's being taught in schools. So in Florida, they passed this bill, HB 1557, that said you could not teach gender studies or LGBTQ plus studies to kindergartners. Okay. I don't think that's, yes, okay. This was widely interpreted, however, eventually interpreted to mean K through 12. What this meant was that in high schools, for example, queer clubs or any sort of affiliated clubs like that couldn't operate. You couldn't teach things in the classroom about queer history or gender studies or anything like that. So there are a lot of people that felt this was really an overreach. But for DeSantis, this polished his credentials as a cultural warrior for the Republican Party. Disney was under pressure to release a statement opposing this. And to give you some background, I think I'm getting a little out of order, but to give you some background, the Disney company kind of prided itself as being a queer-friendly company. And part of that stems from their experience with the community, especially in Disneyland, where starting in the 70s, there were self-organized, what they called gay days, in which the LGBTQ community would show up in Disneyland in mass to sort of have community. And Disney very quickly realized, wow, their money is just as good as anybody else's, and they have a lot of money to spend, and therefore Disney began sponsoring these gay days, or certainly, letting them happen, and then eventually sponsoring them. Disney felt this was good business. The other thing Disney had done in the 90s was in Florida, when there had been resistance to having same-sex partners being covered by health insurance, Disney felt that that would give them a leg up in the employment market. So they, as a company, had a policy or recognized a policy that would extend health coverage to same-sex partners. And once they did that, other Florida businesses followed in order to kind of compete with Disney. And eventually Disney pushed that through because of that action as a statewide policy, and eventually, obviously, in the rest of the country, that also became a common policy. So Disney had this reputation as being a progressive company, and the employees who worked for it often felt that they worked for Disney because it was a progressive company. So when this was going down, they wanted Disney to make a statement opposing this bill, supporting the abolition of the bill. So Disney released this statement. You cannot find this statement anywhere on the Disney website. It's basically through Fox Business, or X has copies of it, but Disney has removed this, doesn't exist. But they released this press release. So like I said, Disney was a progressive company. Conservatives painted it often as a woke company. It has a kind of complicated history. And I have this scene, excuse me, this is from the Jungle Cruise movie, in case you don't recognize it. And this is the sort of complicated relationship Disney has with the queer community, or with just in general, because in this movie you have The Rock, whose main love interest is, I forget her name, but this is his love interest's brother. And the brother is pretty, pretty much plays what you would call, I guess, in the old days, a fae character, right? So, fairly, ooh, and he's in a white suit in the jungle, all that kind of stuff, right? Well, in one scene, he sits down with The Rock, and he explains to The Rock, hey, I'm only out here because my family's rejected me because I fell in love with the wrong person, and he and I weren't allowed to blah, blah, blah. So it's very clear this guy is gay. Great. That scene takes place apart from any other characters in a situation completely removed that has nothing to do with the story. So, i.e., easily exercised by censors in countries where that makes people nervous, and it doesn't affect the movie in any way. In fact, even the scene itself is about 60 seconds. It doesn't even affect the runtime. That is often the criticism leveled at Disney, and was part of the reason why, when the HB thing came out, they felt this pressure to sort of prove that they were actually queer friendly, and so they released this statement. Meanwhile, we have Ron DeSantis. Who's Ron DeSantis? He is a Ivy League graduate, right? So this is, that's a whole other topic, of course, that how many people in the MAGA movement are from the Ivy Leagues, but he came up through the Tea Party, and he won the Florida election in 2018, but not by a very large margin. But he then proceeded to sort of take, a lot of control, and he entered into MAGA politics because he had this commercial during his election that, he read this thing about building a wall to his kid. And a lot of people looked at him and said, aha, here is the next guy. This is the guy that's going to replace Donald Trump, who's on the ropes and no longer popular. So when Disney released that press statement, Ron DeSantis took that as a challenge to sort of show that he was not going to back down against what he called this woke corporation, that he would take it down and teach everybody a lesson about the strength of MAGA politics. So after that statement was released, DeSantis went to the Florida legislature and asked them to undo the Reedy Creek Improvement District agreement. Now, if you are trying to stop an opponent, cutting their legs off is a pretty good way to do that. And this, he felt, and he was not wrong, would cut Disney's legs off, because it would no longer have control over its resort, and would have to instead, like it does in California, go to an independent board every time they wanted to do something. So the legislature at that point, very much in DeSantis' pocket, passes this Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, which does not flow quite as well. And this new board was stocked with DeSantis allies. And DeSantis basically announced that he was going to instruct them to have more oversight, which would include things like weekly inspections of the monorail, which would mean the monorail would be shut down all day as they inspected it. So you can imagine Disney did not like that idea. And a bunch of other things that he was going to do to basically cripple Disney's ability to do business. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. Disney is the #1 employer, private employer in Florida by far, right? And generates billions in tax revenue over the past 70 years or 50 years rather. So, Disney felt like, well, look, this is all some kind of weird misunderstanding. once you, Ron DeSantis, and the rest of the Florida legislature realize what you have done, you will stop because we are Disney and you don't do that to us. Unfortunately, for Disney, that didn't really work. And Ron DeSantis basically doubled down to show that he was not afraid of a business that wouldn't kind of kowtow and behave. So, without boring you into all the sort of nitty-gritty details, essentially what happened is they went back and forth, and Disney sued DeSantis and the legislature, saying they were being targeted politically. DeSantis sued them back, and it was kind of a legal mess. And then Disney did this kind of interesting move, which was genius, and I think was pivotal, but in the short term proved to be just antagonizing to DeSantis. But during the last meeting of the Reedy Creek District, right before they were dissolved, Disney put forth a proposal that the Reedy Creek District gave Disney complete control of its own resort until the last grandchild of King Charles III died. So, and there's some legal reason why the King Charles III was picked. But this is, so that's, conceivably 70, 80 years, right? At least, maybe 90 of complete control. And they did this, they put it in the minutes, and then they all went home. And like 2 weeks later, somebody from the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District was reading the minutes and was like, what the? And all hell broke loose because DeSantis rightly felt that he'd been done an end run around. So he sued to basically nullify that, et cetera. They went back and forth with the courts. Disney at one point very publicly canceled plans to build a Florida office building that would have been about $1 billion investment into Florida. But basically, a couple things happened. By 2024, so after about a year of this going back and forth and legal wrangling, DeSantis was kind of drifting away. This was as the race for president was heating up in the summer of 2024, and it was becoming very apparent that Donald Trump was roaring back and that DeSantis was not going to be able to fight him off. And so DeSantis kind of gave up. Disney was able to work with the new board, and really today, the new board is basically rubber stamping the way that the Reedy Creek District did. There's, I'm sure that there's still friction, and I'm sure that Disney has to put on a dog and pony show like it does in California, but it kind of got its way. And in fact, in 2024, Disney announced that it would invest something like $15 billion in its parks, including Florida. So my question is, how do we sort of look at what happened? And I used the idea of framing theory, and this is the idea that basically any government, any political institution has a limited amount of resources. It can't do everything that it wants to. So it needs to pick and choose the things that it's going to address, the things that it's going to work on. And it does this through framing, agenda framing, by either the government or forces outside the government, business, interest groups, saying this is what's important, right? This is what you should be focusing on. And that framing agenda means that when the government, things that are important are not necessarily objectively important, but they are subjectively important. They're brought up as points the government should address because people have been called to action around those things. And what we see in the case of Disney and DeSantis is both of them trying to frame this agenda, trying to frame what's going on by using certain language and by trying to make the story fit a narrative that will benefit them. So you have two narratives. One is DeSantis trying to frame this as, here is a woke company that is out of control, doing things that are basically, if not illegal, at least sort of anti-government, and they need to be brought to heel. So you have DeSantis using these kind of different languages. He calls Disney a corporate kingdom, right? So that is, definitely trying to sort of view them as somehow not really American, not really democratic. He talks about, Disney controls its own government and that it is above the law, right? So DeSantis is coming in not to punish Disney, but to rectify a situation that is clearly anti-American, anti-government, and just plain wrong, right? He basically calls Disney woke, which in the MAGA world is is considered to be a pejorative term. And he often, in his press conferences, would talk about the things that Disney had were special advantages, were things that others didn't have, and therefore that was unfair, right? So he frames this all about how Disney is doing something wrong, and he is there to correct it. On the other hand, you have Disney, and Disney frames it as retaliation, as anti-business, and anti-Florida. Disney very much paints itself as this innocent victim of political retribution, right? So you have one of the largest corporations in the world as sort of this, poor innocent thing that needs rescuing. It's a little funny in a way. And from a purely political scientist point of view, the Reedy Creek District was so absurd that, when Disney paints itself as a victim, you're like, my gosh, you ran your own local government. That you were not the victim here, but they were definitely able to say, look, I mean, as Bob Iger, who was the chief executive, he asked this question during the height of it: says, does the state want to invest more, employ more people, and pay more taxes or not? I mean, this is, is Governor DeSantis interested in doing what he's supposed to be doing, or is he just fooling around? And so Disney was able to frame this as, look, DeSantis is actually undermining Florida's future and its prosperity by coming after us. All right. So then when it did that kind of end run around there, and frankly, it was a brilliant PR move, because I don't think Disney, maybe they honestly felt like, oh, we can get away with this, right? But the whole thing about King Charles III, it just seemed a little farcical. But from a PR perspective, it made DeSantis look like an idiot because he had no idea what was going on. It made Disney look like a sort of clever, for lack of a term, because it's no longer PC, but like Briar Rabbit, right? And this very clever animal that was able to get away with stuff. And of course Disney again was acting like this innocent thing. Hey, everything we did was in the agenda, and you could have looked at it ahead of time, and everything we did was signed legally, and we're just these innocent people who really stuck it to Ron DeSantis, by the way, right? It's all good. Okay. So in the end, I think both parties were able to frame the narrative in a way that did suit them. DeSantis was able to push this as a story about corporate overreach that needed correcting, and that he was strong enough and a good enough leader that he was going to be able to do it, even if it was this beloved company. And yes, he understood that, but still, the law is the law, fairness is fairness. And Disney was really able to frame this as they were somehow victims of some horrible crime that had been committed against them, and that they, what they had before was all legal, and it's not their fault, but it is, of course, that they had their own government that they control. However, I would say both of their framing efforts, although successful in framing, were not successful in accomplishing what they wanted to accomplish at the end of the day. Disney was not able to save the Reedy Creek District. It is now under this Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, and technically, it now has to jump through more hoops. It now has to sort of be a bit more participatory and inclusive in its governing of the resort. I think Disney did sort of come to terms with it and was able to realize that it was still going to be able to make boatloads of cash despite this new oversight. Ron DeSantis, on the other hand, I think he probably did not, he didn't get what he wanted, which was to sort of show people that he was going to be tough on Disney. I mean, he did end up replacing the district and all of that. But, and this is what I'm working on for a paper in April, is there is seemingly a correlation between his polling numbers and the evolving Disney story. That his polling numbers began to crash as the Disney story unfolded. Now, correlation is not causation, but there's this link that DeSantis went from being viewed as this kind of cultural warrior and a MAGA warrior to being kind of a bully. And he was picking on this company that most people loved and felt was a generally okay company, and that maybe he pushed it a little too far. I think that, coupled with Disney's runaround with the King Charles thing, made him look kind of stupid or not on the ball enough. There's not enough time to get into the Central Florida Tourism District soap opera. There was extramarital affairs and accusations of just all sorts of stuff, right? Which didn't make DeSantis look good, because those were his people that he put into that. And at the end of the day, I think there were lots of other factors, including the uber factor of Trump, that by June of 2024, about a year and a half into this, Ron DeSantis was not polling at 45%, but polling at 14% in the Republican nomination process, and he would eventually bow out from that process. Like I said, again, not conclusive that it was because of Disney, but Disney certainly didn't help him establish the credentials that he thought he would. Okay, so I just spoke for a long time, very quickly. Questions? Other questions? Yes, Nikki.
So how did the gay community frame the conflict, right? Because I think for a lot of what I was reading at the time was that that this certainly, Disney was framing it as Ron DeSantis being anti-business, but a lot of people were framing it as, DeSantis was saying they're too woke. A lot of people were saying maybe they're not woke enough, or.
Well, yeah, the initial brouhaha, right, was Disney pushing back over this anti-queer law. And that quickly got lost in this story of business, right? And I think very quickly, well, for one thing, the current chief executive, or contemporary chief executive at that time, whose name escapes me, anyway, he basically was out like 6 months later, and Bob Iger, who had been before him, came back to fix things. And part of the fixing was to calm things down with Florida and kind of repair some of that. And so that whatever the HB 1557 still exists. Florida is notoriously not friendly in the schools towards that. So I think, from the queer community, it's kind of like, well, gee, thanks, but you dropped that pretty quickly once money became the issue. So I think that's, there was, and this is what I said, Disney is a woke company. Disney is in many ways. In other ways, it sometimes feels opportunistic or very business driven. When they decide to really double down on that and back it, it seems like it's a business opportunity. There were two films, Strange Worlds and Buzz Lightyear, that both had queer characters as fairly main characters. Strange Worlds was the main character, and there was a lot of pushback, and I think what you will probably, what we are now seeing is films that were developed after that coming out 3-4 years later, because it takes a while to make a film, and you see no hint of any queer characters anymore. And I think Disney realized that was, and so again, that, are they committed to that, or is it just, well, we realized it wasn't paying off at the box office? I don't know. Anyway, that's a whole, there are many more people much better versed in that, doing many papers and books on that with Disney these days.
I think I just read that something like 1 million people have just canceled their Disney Plus subscriptions. So any feelings about Disney handling itself politically right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we may never know the truth, but I think probably what happened is 1 million people canceled Disney Plus. I heard people canceling vacations. And I think Disney saw that and said, well, there's a different relationship with Sinclair and Nexstar. That's a little bit more complicated, but if they start losing those customers that are paying them $20 a month, I think that Disney realized that was a bigger hit than having to kind of wrestle WST back, to show Jimmy Kimmel. And so, yeah, I think, anything with Disney is money, right? People complain about the parks being overcrowded, then they should stop going, because Disney will not uncrowd the parks as long as they can make money. They're never going to leave money on the table. And that, like any good business, it's about the money. And so that's what you always have to kind of trace it back to. Like,
why do we like Disney? That's right. Why do we like? So here you have.
Are you going to give me a book deal? I mean,
Yeah. I'm trying to do what I can. Better be the collection, and I better get the introductory chapter. But why? I mean, why do we stand up for Disney? Because you could easily stand up here and do an hour of everything Disney's ever done wrong, and everybody's ever complained, and it filters. I have a Star Wars shirt on. It filters down to Star Wars fans. Disney messed everything up. Marvel, Disney's messed everything Marvel up. Why on earth, culturally, do we stand up for Disney?
The short answer is that Disney himself, Walt Disney himself, was a very keen observer of American culture, and I think certainly up until his death, he was able to tap into what Americans wanted. I mean, if we think about Mickey Mouse, that's great. Also think about Snow White, right? Massive success. And then think about the Mickey Mouse Club or Davy Crockett. I mean, just absolute blowing out of the water success. Disneyland, another big, everything he did up until his death, the rest of the United States was able to sort of say, yes, this is exactly what we want right now. Mass consumption of that stuff. And then I think today we kind of look back at Disney as this source of when America was good, right? This whole, not to bring MAGA back into it, but this idea, the genius of Disney is that for everybody it's different, right? When I look back at Disney, when somebody else looks back at Disney, we all have a different idea about what it's portraying as when the United States was this great thing. And it's different for everybody. There's enough variety in there that you can pick and choose. I was surprised by discovering the Disney studies people over the past year or so, how many people of, so minority cultures or ethnicity or queer who could tell you exactly how Disney celebrated them. And at the same time, like you're pointing out, they could also show how Disney completely, annoyed them. But I was just like, everybody could find something in Disney that they're like, that's me up there. That is what's going on. And I think that's, but like I said, it's a book or many books have been written. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you all very much.